The first concept we're going to look at is the big one of all, and that is, of course, the concept of God. Now, already in this course, we've looked at the fact that the Israelite understanding of God was different to its neighbors. It was connected to an understanding of monotheism, so therefore one God, rather than polytheism, many gods, or even animism, where God is in the particular elements around the world. Rather, God was a personal God. God was a relational God. Those two things are two of the most important aspects of understanding God within the Tanakh and within Israelite culture, is the understanding of God as being both personal and relational. The third thing that you need to understand, and so we'll write those up, so we've got personal, relational, and then the third one, which is very important, is present. Now, sometimes, of course, when we read the New Testament, we talk about the fact that Jesus comes and makes God present here on earth. Now, the truth of it is that incarnation, or the word incarnation, doesn't mean that God is present on earth, but rather that God becomes flesh, becomes human. That's a different concept. We need to understand that one of the particularities, one of the particular interesting things about Judaism was that they always believed that God was present with them. Not only in Jesus. Jesus wasn't making God present. God had been present through the Spirit right from the beginning. If you look at Genesis chapter 1, it says that in the beginning God created the world, but the Spirit hovered over the deep. It hovered over the void. That means that the Spirit was there. God was present on earth right from the beginning. It's a very important understanding about the Hebrew understanding of God. God wasn't someone that we've got to somehow get to, but rather God was someone who came to be present with us. And of course, the ideal then of the relationship with God is continuing to be in the presence of God. If anything shows forth that within the Garden of Eden, is that in the Garden of Eden it says that Adam walked with God. He walked with God. And then, of course, after they'd eaten the forbidden fruit, we realize that they hid from God. And one of the big things is that God says, "Why do you hide from me? Why have you hidden from me? So why are you no longer looking for and acknowledging my presence?" So when you look at those three things, it makes the concept of God within Judaism very different to the gods around them. Very different to the pagan gods that would have been around Israel at the time. A God who is personal, a God who you can connect to. In fact, you can talk to, you can speak to, you can call Father. Relational, a God who is wanting to be in relationship with His creation. And the third thing is that a God who is present here on earth. Not a God who we've somehow got to get to. That was the problem with the Tower of Babel, is that the people thought that they needed to get to God. And God says to them, "No, what are you doing? I'm already here. I'm already with you. I'm already in your presence." And of course, that's seen particularly within the Tanakh, in, for example, the presence of God in the Ark of the Covenant, in the tabernacle, and then later on in the history, in the temple. So, we need to understand all those things about the nature of God in order to understand the Tanakh better. Because for them, they didn't have to try and earn God's favor. They didn't have to try and make themselves present to God. God was already present here with them. God was already involved in them. God was already the center point of their existence and their life. So when we read Tanakh, we always need to read it with an understanding of God, not that comes from paganism, but an understanding of God that comes from Judaism, which is that God is personal, relational, and present. Now, of course, the word God is in Hebrew. The word God, in fact, comes from the language called Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon. And so it's not the Greek word or the Hebrew word for God. The Hebrew, or the oldest Hebrew word for God, is the word El. And so effectively, whenever you see that word El within the Tanakh, you obviously will know that it's talking about God, including Israel or Beth El. Bethel, of course, being the place where Jacob had his dream of the ziggurat, the dream of angels going up and down from heaven. Is that it's at that place that he then made a little stone idol or stone connection altar and called it Bethel, the house of God. So what you have there is that El would be the oldest, and in fact it would have predated Judaism, it would have predated the Israelites. That word El would have been part of maybe even an ancient or the pagan religions of that area would have called the top god, their main god of their pantheon, as it's called, which pantheon is a Greek meaning all the gods or the collection of gods, El being the top one. Of course, the one that we know best about God is the one that comes out of 4 consonants. It's the word YHWH. Now, that particular word, we have no idea how to pronounce it. I know that many of you would have heard the name Yahweh, and in fact we may use that word Yahweh, but the truth of it is we don't know if it is Yahweh. It could have been something else. It could be pronounced differently, because the Jews themselves never pronounced the word. So whenever they got to this word in Tanakh, they would skip the word, and instead of saying Yahweh, they would use the word Adonai. Adonai, which means Lord, And the reason for that is that they found themselves to be unworthy of saying the name of God. They weren't worthy of saying the name of God, so effectively they would say Adonai. So we don't know how to really pronounce that word. And yet that's one of the older words, the older parts of the Tanakh are written with Yahweh as it's the name for God. But of course, as I said, whenever a Jewish person would read it, they would skip over it. Instead of saying Yahweh, they would say Adonai. Adonai. And again, there's a deep reverence, a deep respect for the person, for the name of God. In Jewish culture, in Israelite culture, in fact in Middle Eastern culture, a name is more than just something that someone gives you. A name embodies your whole person, your character, your ability, your relationship. And so when we talk about the name of God, we're not just talking about God or Yahweh or El or Elohim or whatever the other names would be, but rather we're talking about the whole person of God. So you can think about that in terms of the Ten Commandments, where it says, you shall respect the name of God. And what that means then, because it's not just name, just not saying God, but rather the whole character and person and ability of who God is. The final thing I want to deal with is that in fact we need to realize that Yahweh and El are not the only names for God within the Tanakh. In fact, there are many, many, many names. Some of you have heard of them, like El Shaddai or El Nisi, or many of the other names that are connected to God in His particular activity and what God does for them. So God my healer, God my protector, God my provider, and so on and so on. So whenever God gets another name which connects to what God does. There is one strange name for God, and that's the name Elohim. And the reason why it's strange is because Elohim is in fact a plural. It's really gods. And you can see some of Elohim within, for example, Genesis chapter 1, where in Genesis chapter 1 it says, let us make man in our image. In our image. There's a plural or plurality of God that connects with this word Elohim. Almost in a sense, what the writer is doing is he's saying that God is connected to all the gods. All the gods are consumed, are assumed within the God person. Of course, for us now, in terms of Protestant Christianity, what we have the Trinity. And not just Protestant, but in fact general Christianity, we have the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity, which says that God is 3 in 1. But we're going to be dealing with some of the doctrines of the church in another course and another module. This one is just an interesting one to acknowledge that God is within the Godhead, connected, that there's a sense of community and understanding within that. And so that's what we can add. We can add He's personal, He's relational, He's present, and He is communal. He's connected and wanting to connect himself to others.